a bit about the Connector, which was established by a collective of organizations, Emergency Management Victoria, Foundation for Rural and Regional Renewal, the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, and the Victorian Council for Social Service. Along with this collaborative of organizations, the Connector is also a website of curated resources, which are designed to create a simple way for people and communities to build disaster resilience and climate change knowledge through sharing of information resources and inspiration across Victoria and Australia. And today, we will be doing just that by gathering for a discussion with this panel of experts, which I am very, very excited about. So today I am joining you from the lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to recognize the traditional owners of the lands on which we live and work. I also would like to pay respect to elders past and present and acknowledge their continuing connections to culture, community, land, and sea. I would also like to recognize the traditional owners of the many different lands where you are all joining us from today and celebrate the diversity of the First Nations people and their cultures. So once again, hello, and thank you for joining us. I hope everybody's in that is wanting to be with us today, but I can still hear some ding dings, so we will just keep admitting people as we go. First and foremost, we will be recording today's webinar, and this will be emailed through to each participant in attendance today following the session. In terms of today's format, we'll be inviting each of our panelists to briefly discuss their perspectives on the topic. And then following that, we'll be opening the floor to Q&A and a wider discussion. So with that, we've activated the chat and QA functions, so please feel free to comment and or ask questions throughout. So let's get to why we're all here. So as many of you would know, for decades, disaster researchers and practitioners have been emphasizing that while hazards may be natural, disasters are not. And that using the term natural disasters can mean we are only treating the symptoms, leading us to avoid tackling the real issues that are at the roots of disaster risks. So kicking off this discussion is our first panelist, Professor Cheryl Desha. Professor Desha is the Science and Innovation Director at Natural Hazards Research Australia. Thank you so much for joining us today. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dawn, and privileged to be here amongst our community colleagues. I am dialing in from Meanjin in Brisbane, which is the Yagara Turrbal country, and we are as hot as everywhere else today. It's a screaming 32 degrees as we haven't finished winter yet. I think that's a clarion call to have these kinds of conversations. As opening speaker, panelist, I thought I might cover some language. I am an environmental engineer trained in risk analysis and management and nature-based solutions. And originally I've been in more than, I don't know, about 15 years, been in the world of sustainable development, and then more recently in disaster management and disaster risk reduction. So I've gone on a pretty steep learning curve around language myself and asked all those questions. So hopefully you can mark me on how well I do today. I'm also Indian, Welsh, Aussie as a migrant to Australia, and I often think from sort of somewhere out of the moon looking in on the planet, and then language becomes even more critical in that context because word really does create our world. And if we can have a consistency of language and appreciation of what it can mean, then what can be really inspiring. So that's my context for my contribution today. So I've been thinking a lot in my new job as Science Innovation Director for NHRA. I'm 3 months in this week, so it's sort of nearly my 100-day anniversary, about asking the right questions so that we can fund research that's useful, usable, and used. And it means being really clear about the words that we use because they matter. So stepping through, I thought I'd step through forward, Dawn. So, micro little just check in for us all that we think of similar things and we think about hazards. So hazards are things or situations that have the potential for harm, like injury, ill health, property damage, environmental damage, etc. Natural hazards include bushfires, floods, storm surge, cyclones, tsunamis, extreme heat, and so on. So that's cool. What about risk? Risk is a tricky one. Risk is about the likelihood or the chance that we're actually going to be exposed to that hazard and the impact that it's going to have on us. And, a couple of my PhDs have been looking at the impact that it's going to have on us as non-humans as well as humans, because it's not just all about human beings in that context. So then disasters are the consequences of those hazards actually becoming real with the big impacts. And I was just having a Google through a few different definitions of disasters, and the International Federation of Red Cross send a framework for disaster risk reduction. These are great places to go to. And so causing serious disruptions to the functioning of a community that exceeds its capacity to cope with its own resources. There's so many good words in there that can help us have some agency around what to do with disasters that are caused by natural hazards. We've used natural disasters in the past when perhaps we've actually meant disasters caused by natural hazards. But sometimes squishing words down to just a couple of words can cause a bit of disconnect, so you have to be careful there. But the slight shift in language, for me, it allows me to think about complications. So when such, disasters caused by natural hazards are complicated by other hazards, so cybersecurity, biological hazards, and so on. And we can think about in that case, which makes me really excited, the opportunities that we have in that context, because we can work to reduce the risks associated with disasters that are borne by natural hazards. We might not be able to remove the natural hazard itself, but we can reduce its size potentially in terms of its impact on us. And we might also be able to improve our ability to withstand our interaction with the natural hazard by protecting ourselves, our homes, and our community. So, Dawn, I hope that just that little trip down language lane sets us up for a rollicking good ride in our conversation this afternoon, and looking forward to hearing how the panelists flow on from this. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was a great intro. I think it's always good to set the scene and get some of the definitions down pat, so thank you. And we'll be looping back with you on that. In the meantime, let's head to our second panelist, who is Steve Muncaster. Steve is Principal Advisor, Emergency Management Reform at the Victorian Head Office for the Victoria State Emergency Service. Thank you for being a part of this discussion. Over to you.
Thanks for that, Dawn, and thanks there, Cheryl, for some introductory remarks. We didn't collude on this, but I think hopefully I used the terminology in the same fashion as you've done there. Again, I'll just share the screen here. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak. I do have an engineering background and a data analytics background, so that really, I guess, frames my approach to these types of questions. So I do come at it from a quite analytical point of view. And just a warning, this presentation does contain an equation, but I promise there's only one equation in this presentation. Just moving on to, I too want to acknowledge Australia's First Nations people and their deep and enduring connection to land and its natural rhythms. I think, especially in this context, for thousands of years, they've understood and adapted to the natural hazards like bushfires, flood, and drought. Their traditional knowledge and practices have been passed down through generations and offer valuable insights into living sustainably and resiliently within the environment we have in this country, and guide us, I guess, in making our own better decisions to manage and adapt to these natural hazards. Just a note from the sponsor here, as Dawn said, I do work for the State Emergency Service. I do just want to put forward that the views I express in this presentation are my own and don't necessarily reflect those of the Victorian SES nor the Victorian government as well. Circles. As I said, the title of this talk was Circles and a Triangle. And again, as Cheryl just said there before, when we talk about risk in the context of disasters, it is essential to understand, and here's our equation, that risk is equal to the intersection of the hazard, the exposure to that hazard, and the vulnerability. Hence the three circles. And really what we're focusing on when we look at that risk is that intersection of those three circles. And I guess this is in the past, that intersection where we've termed it as a natural hazard or a risk of a natural hazard occurring. A hazard, I talked about before, is a natural phenomenon. So it's an earthquake, flood, cyclones, droughts, storms. These events are independent. Well, you could argue maybe not so much these days with possible climate change, but independent of human action. There really are truly natural environmental events. However, those other two circles that are up there, exposure and vulnerability, are largely driven by ourselves and the choices that we've made over the period of time to create both the exposure, which references the presence of people, property, ecosystems in an area where the hazards may occur. For instance, building homes on a floodplain increases their exposure. And then the second component of that is around vulnerability. This is how susceptible those particular exposed elements are to harm. And this can include factors such as building materials, preparedness, and particularly also to social inequalities. We often see that communities which are more vulnerable in emergencies are those ones where they have poorly constructed buildings or the community has limited resources, making them more vulnerable to the impacts and the exposure to that natural hazard as well, and then increasing the risk that they may experience. So while natural hazards are natural and inevitable, how much risk we face is really shaped by the choices that we made, and the choices that we make not only in the past, but also to the choices we make now and the choices we're making into the future, particularly when it comes to the exposure and vulnerability of those two components. And really what we're trying to do here is separate out those circles. So if we remove that intersection there before, we really do go some way, a long way to sort of moving away from seeing things as natural disasters to really understanding there's a natural hazard, and then our ability to manage these other aspects around our exposure and vulnerability play a key part in that. But how do we do that? And I guess this is where the triangle comes in. And I said I come from a background in engineering and in data analytics. Really what we're looking at here is the triangle, which is the data, information, knowledge, and wisdom triangle. It's a powerful framework for making informed decisions, particularly around reducing natural hazard risk, separating out those circles. So at the base of the triangle there is our data, raw, unprocessed facts. In the context of disaster risk reduction, data might be aspects to do with historical earthquakes, weather patterns, population statistics. But data alone itself, while it's good to have, isn't useful without a context. So that context is really important. And this is where we start to process and analyze that data and becomes information. For instance, we take that information on past flood events, we map them over time and space, and we see the patterns. This information tells us where floods have occurred and how often they have occurred, and gives us the first layer, I guess, into insights of potential risks or potential exposures or potential vulnerabilities we may have as well. So as we move up the triangle, knowledge is then derived by analysing and interpreting this information and helps us understand why floods happen in a certain area, perhaps due to geographic features, urban development, and a whole range of other components there, really, which are about our overlay of exposure and vulnerability on that natural system. With that knowledge, we can begin to identify factors that contribute to disaster risk. And at the top of the triangle there is wisdom. So how can we, and wisdom is really about the application of this knowledge to make informed decisions, not only in our planning, but also in a way when a particular natural hazard occurs, how we may warn communities, how we engage with those communities, how we understand the different aspects of those communities, what are the key messages that resonate with those particular communities, what are the key vulnerabilities, what are the key values, I guess, of those particular communities as well. So really, in a flooding context, you can see that wisdom is understanding the patterns of those floods, the contributing factors, the potential impacts, to develop then strategies to minimise those exposures and vulnerabilities that we have over the top of that. So this may evolve in implementing better land use planning, investing in early warning systems, reinforcing infrastructure. Really what we do again is trying to separate out those three circles that we had there before. So in essence, the triangle provides us with a structured approach to making decisions that can save lives and protect communities and reduce natural disaster risks. By progressing from data to wisdom, we move from raw facts to actual strategies that are just both exposure and vulnerability, ultimately enhancing our ability to manage and mitigate hazards. And to wrap up there, I did promise, there's a second equation here. I know I only promised there was one, but this second equation is, well, then how does this all come together? So we've got three circles plus a triangle. So we've got our risk equation there, risk, hazard, exposure, vulnerability. We've got an understanding as the intersection of those natural hazards with more those human-driven exposures and vulnerability. We understand then the role of human choice on that. We emphasize that hazards are natural and the level of risk is shaped by our decisions and how we regard them, where and how we build and how we prepare and move towards a more resilient set of communities. Combining that then with that triangle around data, information, knowledge and wisdom, we can then use that to inform and culminate those particular aspects together to put in place some really strategic decisions around reducing disaster risk over time. And one of the key points, and leads me back to some of the aspects to do with our First Nations people, we can then integrate that traditional knowledge as well, an understanding of the landscape, an understanding of the patterns that have occurred over many, many generations. Acknowledging and learning from First Nations people, deep understanding of natural hazards can help us enhance some of our more modern risk management practices as well. So just in some final thoughts here, let's use this knowledge to make better decisions that reduce risk, not only respects and incorporates those traditional practices that have been long effective, but also to looks then to use some of the more modern techniques we've got around some of the modern analytics, some of the modelling that we do have now, and some of the more broader data and information we have around vulnerabilities and population to then build a more resilient and sustainable environment for ourselves, but also to minimise those impacts of natural disasters, or should I say natural hazards, how they impact upon our communities. And again, combining all those things together, we can end up in a situation where we can end up with no natural hazards. So again, thank you for the opportunity to speak, and back to you there, Dawn. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I love a good visual. I'm one of those people that I really appreciate that diagram, so it helps me to digest. So thank you very much. Over to our third panelist. Our third panelist is Rosita Vincent. Rosita is co-CEO at the Neighbourhood Collective Australia, and auspiced under the Neighbourhood Collective Australia is the Multicultural Emergency Management Partnership. That's quite a lot of words, MEMP. I'd love to hear from you today, Rosita. Thank you. Over to you.
Thanks, Dawn, and hello, everybody. Yes, I'm coming to you actually today from NHRA country. So right in the heart of Victoria is how I like to think of where we're based. That's in Bendigo. We work across Victoria, but we're based here in Bendigo in NHRA country. A little bit about me, my background, a little different to Steve. I'm coming from a community planning and development background. I'm a Mexican Australian and migrated with my family to the remote outback town, New South Wales town of Bourke. I don't know if you've heard of the saying, the back of Bourke. That's where I grew up from the early 70s. And I think just that experience and coming from community development, I guess, lens, in my growing up years there in Bourke, I was aware of some natural hazards that we experienced as a community, and I really got to experience the strength of community coming together and facing those hazards. So it's been really interesting in the work that we're doing, looking at vulnerabilities, looking at gaps, looking at problems with communities, but also really looking at what the strengths are that are there And at Neighbourhood Collective Australia, we work to kindle, or some would say rekindle. It's already been there, but maybe we've lost some of that ability to strengthen community. You know, to look at what it looks like when communities are led by the residents within those communities. And we work hard to have multicultural communities at the heart of what we do. And one of the things that we know about natural hazards is that they have an impact on vulnerable communities or multicultural communities in the space that we're working in. One of the sorry, I was going to say with the MEMP, Multicultural Emergency Management Partnership. That's an independent collective made up of multicultural community leaders and representatives of all of Victoria's emergency management agencies and organisations. It's a pretty unique model that came about during COVID, and its purpose is to build trust between the emergency management sector and multicultural communities, to be able to build trust and communication, and to improve the emergency management sector's ability to work effectively with multicultural communities, and to also improve, you know, the other way around as well, to be able to help multicultural communities to understand how emergency organisations work and how even just the system here in Victoria works. So we are wanting to help the emergency management sector be able to work more effectively with multicultural communities to address those disproportionate risks that multicultural communities face during emergencies. The MEMP strongly believes that disasters are not natural, and though while we think that, we know that the communities that we represent they actually believe that disasters are natural in many ways and are inevitable in many ways. So although we believe they're not, a lot of communities that we work with actually believe that they are inevitable. We can't really prepare for them. So that's significant. And this comes from their kind of pre-arrival experience for many of these new communities, where government and civil society may lack the resources, including financial resources, or the infrastructure to proactively prepare for disasters or extreme weather events. And we believe too that that's exacerbated by global actors who tend to support recovery efforts rather than preparedness or looking at long-term solutions, like Cheryl was mentioning earlier. So, yeah, in Australia, we see that multicultural communities are disproportionately affected by emergencies and disasters. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we know that people born overseas were twice as likely to die from the disease, and those born in non-English speaking countries had even higher death rates. So we know that that didn't have anything to do with the virus. It actually had to do with the human systems and structures and other factors that came into play that made that devastate multicultural communities at a much higher proportion. Yeah, so I guess in Australia, currently our preparedness and response systems and processes generally favour those that are born in Australia and those who speak English as a first language. For example, all emergency broadcasts are in English, and other ways of gaining warning information, such as the Victoria Emergency app, are also only available in English. So yeah, there's lots of work to be done in that space. So yeah, I'm glad to be here and part of this conversation. Look forward to the conversation and loved what the previous two participants have shared with us.
Thank you so much, Rosita. I think you really elevated some concepts around systems and that preparedness and inequality that we also need to be considering. So another element to keep in mind as we move towards our discussion. So thank you. Our last panelist is John Richardson. John is the Manager Knowledge Development at the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience. So thank you for joining us today, John, and over to you for your thoughts.
Great. Thanks, Dawn. Thanks for having me, everyone. Really, again, it's great to be part of this conversation. And also, like others, I want to acknowledge I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people here in the Kulin Nation. And to Steve's point, I often like to reflect on the fact that our First Peoples have been here for 60,000 years and living with these processes, and how much we can learn. And I think also, to Steve's point, not just from the knowledge, but the wisdom that's been accumulated over the time. So that's certainly something that exercises me a lot. We haven't colluded, but I think everything that everyone else has said, I've got bits and pieces down here. So I'm going to try and make this work without sort of being too repetitive. But I just wanted to, recently I was walking along the Great Ocean Walk at the Otway Ranges here in Victoria, and I was surrounded by sedimentary rocks that were 65 million years old. And, you know, I was watching ocean swell that sort of, you know, was generated thousands of kilometres away. And you start to sort of understand your place in the grand scheme of things, kind of when you sort of confronted by nature. And actually, I was going to say at the outset that I'm not an engineer. I have done an engineering subject once, but I'm actually a geographer and a former health professional. So bringing it to a slightly different lens to all this. So my interest in geology and geography is kind of what sort of prompted me. So I guess I want to ask people to think about, how do you feel in comparison to nature? And if you want to pop that in the chat, that would be, you know, think about that, or just think about it. Because, you know, the meteorological and geological processes that are hazardous, that Steve spoke about, they are forces of nature and they're natural processes. Although, you know, again, I think as Steve made a good point, you know, as humans, we are certainly influencing and changing the meteorological processes through climate change. But I guess the thing about disasters, I guess we didn't know how to sort of speak about or understand disasters as humans over, you know, 10,000 years of sort of human history. And so the actual term disaster, and sort of picking up on Cheryl's point around language, is disastro, which is an ill-starred event. It's from the Latin, or, you know, bad stars. So to Rosita's point, we've often thought this is in the hands of others. It's in the hands of the stars. It's in the hands of various gods and the like. So as humans, we're kind of going, we don't understand these processes. So there just must be something else at work here. And, you know, even things like, you know, acts of God have made their way into our insurance policies. Although I think Billy Connolly and the man who sued God sort of tried to get them out. But, you know, that it is that sort of thing where we almost have kind of parked responsibility for dealing with these calamities with someone else. That all started to change in 1755, and I wasn't alive then, so I had to sort of read this. But the Lisbon earthquake was a major earthquake which destroyed the city of Lisbon, and it was around 10 o'clock on Sunday morning, and it was a day of religious significance. So many people were killed during the earthquake, and so this started to the philosophers of the Enlightenment started to sort of question and sort of say, well, hang on a second, are these really acts of God, or what? You know, what? I mean, there's a whole existential thing there which we're not going to go into, but really start to sort of think about, well, what role has the human hand in this? And as they said, and they looked at it, well, people were killed by the buildings that collapsed on them, not necessarily the earthquake. And I think that's one of the things that we start to kind of really realize is that it's to Steve's point, it's what what cause does the hazard have? And, you know, our dominant narrative around disasters is around we have a hazard and then there's an impact and then we clean it up. And it's kind of this like nice linear thing. If anyone's seen San Andreas and, you know, the rock at the end says, now we rebuild. You know, that's kind of how we sort of think about these things. And yet they're a hell of a lot more complicated than that. And, you know, the classic definition of disaster from the 1930s and 40s from Henry Quarantelli is, you know, it's the intersection of the hazard with the vulnerable population. And so I think vulnerability, and the three colleagues have spoken about that, all spoken about vulnerability. But what is it that makes people vulnerable? And I think that's the thing we often sort of kind of skirt around, and it's human decisions. So it's a human decision that has subdivided land in a floodplain and sold it off. It's a human decision that has built a house either to the standards that were appropriate to the day, or perhaps not. You know, they may have sort of said, no, we're not going to do this. We don't need to do this. And, you know, they're human decisions that also, I think, create the society and you know, and the poverty. And so poverty is one of the, you know, the greatest drivers, I think, of disaster risk. And, you know, it's your ability, whether you do have the ability to get yourself out of harm's way. And, you know, we certainly saw that with Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, where people didn't have enough money for a tank of petrol to be able to drive out of the city to evacuate. Had a car, but didn't have the you know, the financial resources. So I think, you know, and then humans also, I guess, and this again pretty broad, but you know, it's also the thinking we make decisions about the kind of level of inequality we're prepared to tolerate, and so these things I think are also systemic risk factors that we need to be kind of bringing in to a more kind of systemic approach to disaster risk. So they're kind of disasters by choice, and there's a great book by Eileen Kelman. I don't think it's going to be able to come out of my there it is, well worth a read, because he talks about this idea of disaster by choice. Now, and I will finish up in a sec, Dawn, because I'm rambling a bit. But I guess why is this important? Because, you know, and I have heard people say, oh, well, this is just semantics. You're just playing with words and that sort of thing. And I'm so glad that you opened up with this, Cheryl, to sort of say words are important, because they do, you know, they do shape our behaviours and intentions, and we do use them really loosely too. If we said of our 200 odd people who registered, what's your definition of resilience? We would be here for years probably trying to work that one out. So because terms are used loosely, but we know that it's important, particularly when we're sort of thinking about sort of framing policy and sort of framing practice. So the idea of natural disaster in that, I think in that context, there's a sort of can be an abrogation of responsibility. I've been in a community meeting where somebody said, well, I'm not going to prepare because there's nothing you can do about this, and it's just going to happen. So I'm doing nothing. Yet we know there's a whole bunch of things that people can do. If they have the capacity, if they have the knowledge, if they have the resources, and the time to actually kind of reduce harm. So I think. When we hear this, we hear this politicians who sort of say, "Oh, it was a natural disaster. There's nothing we could have planned for." Well, we can plan for these things, and we hear people talk about unprecedented. It's like that's, in my view, is like it's a failure to plan. Most of when you think of people like Steve, whose role is to look at the numbers and the models and the equations and kind of go, yeah, this is about where we reckon this thing can get to. We know this stuff. So I think that's the thing for me, is that the term in some people, oh, I can't do anything about this, so we won't. And we need to actually say, well, we can do something about this. We have a choice. We can choose not to have disasters. And so we start to think about that in a more systemic way. And, and then, that then kind of helps us reduce disaster risk. And, the other thing I think is that, and I've had it, I'm one of those annoying people who I email, editors of newspapers and say, I think you should stop using the term natural disaster. Most of them ignore me, but one sort of came back and sort of said, and we had this backwards and forwards. And I said, like, in the end, does it really matter to you? Because we're actually taking one word out of your word count, which is probably a useful thing. So, if you just say like there's no reason why we can't just call it a disaster. So anyway, that is, there's some reflections, and I'll shut up now and let the conversations continue.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much, John. I think there's also there's a few things that we can, some threads we can pull out of that, and a couple that I definitely think is around that, so that point around there's nothing that we can do, and do we have choices? I think those are really good ones to reflect on. So moving forward, we do have the Q&A open. So I'm sure from all of those viewpoints that were just shared with us, I would encourage you to put your question in the Q&A. We also have some comments in the chat. So we've got some Kate just commenting on, I'm not going to be able to pronounce this, but anthropogenic. Any comments to that from the panel before we head into our Q&A? Jump right in.
You go, John.
Cheryl.
No. You got in before I did.
Yes, maybe. I guess we don't want to add more words. I don't see why we can't just call them disasters. That's just my thing. I mean, I don't think the other thing is, I think for a long time we've talked about cause rather than consequence, and really the thing we're kind of interested in is consequence, and sort of thinking about the consequences, and that's what risk reduction is about, is kind of reducing them. Sure, you've got to understand cause, but really we're focused on reducing impacts on people's health and well-being, their livelihoods, their shelter, and those sorts of things. So look at that. My sort of feeling is I don't think we need to change it. Don't know what others think.
John, I was just going to echo that, language is really important, as Jimmy has pointed out there in the conversation chat, and being mindful of keeping it straightforward, I think, is also really important. So yeah, we could use descriptors, and I often find when I'm writing, I'll try and say it in plain speak and then say what I mean by that. So, I think that acknowledgement of people being a really key factor is super important. When we use our words to talk about what to do about things, I hear you, John. I think keep it straightforward tends to be an easier way to grapple with them being in action. Otherwise, the more words we introduce, we start thinking and talking about the words and get wrapped up in that, in contrast to getting into what we can do about it. I also love the comment around being empowered to be able to do things around it. If you think you can, you're correct. If you think you can't, you're correct. So that's, Dawn, that's back to you, isn't it? That's the community empowerment, community agency conversation that I do love, which is why I was so excited about this webinar.
And I'd just add to that, language matters, and keeping it simple, thinking too of people that don't have English as a first language, and also community leaders who are one of our greatest strengths during disasters, to be able to help them in their job of translating or interpreting into into other languages. And I know, Jimmy, that comment comes from you. Jimmy's part of the MEMP and heads up the Chinese Association here in Victoria.
Wonderful. Any other comments, Steve? Did you have anything, or?
I think it just goes to a point that Cheryl made there before. So I think, and I know in the chat there around approaches to community preparedness, and I guess it is one of the struggle for us as an agency with a role in community preparedness is that one of, and I'm probably parked back to what I was talking about before, while we have a lot more data and information around, we've got to make sure as agencies and the broader sector here who's represented here that we do promote resilience, we do promote self-reliance where we can. I think one of the concerns that we have, and I know it's shared by broader emergency responder agencies, if you like, is if we're building this sense, rather than resilience, we're building reliance, where we're sort of heading towards the point you will be warned, there will be a fire truck in every corner, there will be an SES volunteer there to help you with your trees or sandbag. And I think it's important that we do, again, going back to that point around community preparedness, and I think organisations that Rose represents are really important in terms of building that community understanding and that community capability in this space. We do know that communities that know their neighbours, talk to their neighbours, are better at or have greater resilience when it comes to facing certain hazards. And I think we need to, as agencies, all learn how we may be able to do that, promote that, and move ourselves out of the centre and make sure we put the community aspects at the centre of that and promote that community leadership.
Excellent. We do have some questions coming up in the Q&A. So what I'm going to do is try to address them as they're coming in, and I'll just open it up, jump in, whoever feels inspired first, by all means, respond. For any that we don't get through, I will be collating these and seeing if we can continue the conversation in a different space somehow. So we have Todd Burns has put in the Q&A. I'll read it out just in case anyone's unable to see it. If a hazard is a source or a situation with the potential for harm in terms of human injury or ill health, damage to property, damage to the environment, or a combination of these, what do we call these collective hazards after we have seen the consequences?
Dawn, I might have a go at this, and then John can fix it up for me. I think as I hear Todd ask that question, I'm in the frame of mind of like how we deal with hazards, yeah, and we know that a hazard has the potential for harm. So I think that conversation, Tom, is around each time a hazard happens. So when we see the collective of multiple hazards and we know what the consequences are, we still say it's a hazard with the potential for harm. So like if you have a trip or a slip is still a hazard in your workplace, even if someone's had a trip or a slip. It's just designated as something that we need to be watchful or mindful about. So that occurs to me that it's just an ongoing thing to be watchful or mindful about unless we can get rid of the hazard. So sometimes in risk management, we talk about eliminating the hazard. For natural hazards, well, maybe there are some natural hazards that we could think about eliminating locally. I think it's, it's not a conversation for earthquakes, etc. I think the whole carbon conversation is actually about at least substantially reducing the hazard through getting that carbon back out of our atmosphere. So that's there for me. What do we do about multiple hazards? Well, there's a whole conversation around that cascading, compounding hazards, where the potential isn't it doesn't go up incrementally. It's like a huge leap if two hazards happen to be experienced at the same time. But still, I think the key point there is even if we've experienced it, we still call it a hazard because in the future it still has the potential to visit us with that harm.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I mean, I don't think I need to clean any of that up. Cheryl, that was good.
Yay, good for me. I'll take a little A+ brownie star on that one.
And Steve, like, you're probably better placed than me to comment on this, but I think using the term natural hazard is okay. Like, It's the disaster bit, because they are, as I say, like I kind of said, they're sort of, the forces of nature. They are geological processes, they are meteorological processes. We study them through science and understand them. So I think understanding how those processes become hazardous. Again, we could go, and I do see that described sometimes, the geotechnical hazards and the meteorological hazards. So then again, we're starting to add more words. So, I think that is okay, in my view, is okay to say, look, these are natural hazards, or these are caused by natural processes, hazards caused by natural processes. I don't know, Steve, what do you think?
Oh, I think so. I agree with your sentiment there, John, that really there are things, forces in our planet, in that natural system where we don't really have much control over. And I think I think it's foolish. And I think, again, being someone who's come from the engineering profession, I guess we've had in engineering for a long time there. We thought we could control all of these things. And I think that while we can minimize or mitigate some of the aspects of, there will always be events that will overwhelm any structural mitigation measures that are put in place. So any levies or any building codes or any such like that, we can't build our way out of necessary exposures and vulnerabilities. We can work towards minimizing those and understanding those more fully. And really, I guess to sort of again, if I can jump ahead here a little bit, Dawn, in the chat there, and I think from Donovan, yeah, I guess what we have spoken about here are concepts which are largely been around for a long time, I think. However, what we struggle with is then being able to, again, going to another question, how do we change people's minds that might happen to us? And I guess I use the example in Rochester in the floods of 22, where Vic SES and the local community have done a lot of work around engagement with the local community about the flood risks that they faced. Yet, for whatever reason, during that particular event, when warnings were provided that people were going to be inundated, people didn't leave their homes, or people didn't take heed of those warnings. Now, that's a whole host of reasons there. One's come back to our engagement back with various different cohorts and individuals within that community and their different needs and vulnerabilities, and understanding that. So I think there is a piece there for all of us to think about. Yeah, the science we've evolved, but one of the key things that we need to always think about is human nature and how humans actually interface with those particular hazards. And I think that's a real research challenge for all of us going forward, is to learn how to do that in a more effective manner to again minimise the risks and to particularly life and property in that respect.
Great, thank you. I think there's another comment that's just popped up, so I'll come back and clarify that in a minute. But I'd like to just raise, I'm going to paraphrase a few of the questions that have come up around what sort of practical elements or things could we be thinking about in terms of preparation. So there's one thing with being within an organization that's addressing these types of issues, but from individuals within communities, would you be able to touch on anything so that they could help the people can actually practically walk away with today?
Yeah, I was just looking at Kate's question. I think, is that one, Dawn, that you've reframed there, talking about community preparedness? Yeah.
And Julianne as well. Yeah, there was a few
Julianne,
in there.
I missed that one. Yep. Okay, so I guess probably just what we would say is that you can't just be looking at community preparedness. It needs to be also an equal measure of energy going into the capacity of emergency management organisations to be able to be ready to engage and work with communities in culturally safe and knowledgeable ways. So it kind of, you can't just do one without the other. They both go together. And I know there's some incredible work happening in emergency management organisations here in Victoria post-COVID to become better at that, at being able to work with multicultural communities. It might be addressing racism even in their particular organisations, or it could be having cultural diversity inclusion plans, or all sorts of different ways that that organisations can also be building their capacity. I think as far as community preparedness goes, one of the things that's really important, we know, for multicultural communities is that they really are very much based on relationship rather than on information. So we've learnt from COVID that people listen, like some communities will trust the herd message more than they'll trust something that they've read. So it's just different communities work in different ways. And so being able to have that knowledge already for organisations to know the communities in the areas that they're across, and to know the key people in those communities that influence. It might not be the leader that you think is the person to work with there. So really knowing who the community is and who people look to for leadership. And then also to talking to those people to find out what is it that this community, that your community needs, or what could we be doing to, or what are the questions that are being asked? What are the resources we could be giving? And actually having those conversations prior to the event is really, really helpful. So it's a kind of a big approach. It's not just a little thing, and there's not just a few things to do.
Yeah, great. And if I might extend that question a little bit further, if the other panelists wanted to jump in as well. Karen's posed a question about beyond the prepared, if the panel might like to suggest how we can help organizations, societies, communities to appreciate that disaster preparation is only part of the climate change adaptation. It's the bit we have in place because we're not adapted to a climate changing world. And she's referencing the IPCC's climate resilience development pathways. Any comments around that and addressing that?
It's a great question. I think and having worked in disaster preparedness for a long time, I was going to say that's the easy bit, and we know that it's not. But it is a fairly tangible and recognisable output. But I think there are, organisations need to be thinking about how do we embed this into governance structures in the organisation. And I can see Ayla's comment about trying to shift the language with management and board and the challenges there. But this starts with governance and people understanding what their responsibilities are. If they're in a governance role, it's about thinking about how it can kind of shift the financing of sort of programming and sort of accessing sort of funding and thinking through how we might do that. And that the sort of longer term strategic planning. So I don't think we're particularly good at that. And so, there's certainly some work starting to be done to think about different scenarios, climate-based scenarios, or longer sort of transformative scenarios where that can help people, an organisation, think about or how they might continue and continue to do the work that they do in a transforming world and adapting to the climate by trying to think into the future. And I know we can't. We can't predict the future, but there's certainly enough data now that sort of says, if extreme heat days are going to treble. What does that mean for our organisations and our staff in our organisations? So yeah, there are a couple of thoughts, and Cheryl's obviously got thoughts there too.
Yes, John, the panel's comments from before, I'm just thinking about them as we move through the yarn. I think what comes up for me is that there are so many examples of reviews where we said that we'd learnt something, a lesson. You think about all the inquiries and the commissions, and NHRA, by the way, has a free searchable inquiries database that we can post the link to, and it's just fascinating when you type in keywords there and see all the lesson learning that's happened with all of the investment of federal government funds towards doing lesson learning, and then how we apply that. I think somewhere in that thought bubble around Karen's comment is the need to act on the lessons learned, and being accountable as a government at all levels, and agencies at all levels, to act on the lessons that we learn, which builds into the opportunity to do this long-term shift. So, if you notice that the iceberg's up ahead and you still keep driving the ship towards it, well, that's not a spoiler alert, is it? That you have to shift the tiller, and slowly the ship turns. But good grief, if you don't shift the tiller, you know what exactly is going to happen. Just keep going straight ahead. So it's those nudges in the system from the commissions and the inquiries that come to mind for me as mechanisms that outside community, the government structures can work on actioning, in addition to the agency that communities then have about doing something about it.
Thank you so much. We have 1 minute left, so we have completely absorbed all of our time. There's so much more to get through. I think we all agree, as I'm trying to paste and talk at the same time. I'm not even going to try to consolidate all of that. I think there's a lot more that we probably would love to pull out and discuss. But I would just like to say a very big thank you to each of our panelists today for taking the time out to share your thoughts and views, and for everyone else that has come along to join the conversation. I would suspect we need to have some sort of extension to this session so that we can continue. So we'll be giving that some thought and open to any suggestions on doing so. As you'll see, I have put a survey link in the chat. We would really appreciate if you would take 2 minutes to complete that. It is really, really tick, 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 but really useful for us to know if we're on the mark and what sort of areas you'd be interested in hearing about as we build our programming moving forward. I would also just like to acknowledge our next event is the 10th of October. So that is an acknowledgement of World Mental Health Day. So we're working with Psychology for a Safe Climate. And that will be a session exploring the difference between climate distress and climate emotions, the role of deep listening and dialogue in building climate resilience. So stay tuned, check out our website next week. That session will be promoted then. And for those that haven't visited our website, which is brand new, it's cc4r.org.au. So yes, we look forward to engaging and seeing you all again. Thank you so much, everyone. We will be circulating the webinar video to you following the session, and I'll also be collating a bit of a wrap-up document so that we can consolidate some of the resources that we were able to share with each other today. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, and we look forward to connecting soon. Thank you.